The scent hit Lyra Ashwood before the doors even opened, sharp and cold like frost on metal, and her whole body went still. Every wolf in the grand hall of Blackthorn Castle turned to watch her walk down the long aisle of stone, because everyone already knew what this moment meant. The bond had chosen. Somewhere behind those iron doors stood the one wolf her body and her instincts had been built to find. She had waited for this her whole life. She had imagined it 1,000 times, alone in her small room in the outer Packlands, tracing the idea of a mate like a warm secret kept just for her. She never imagined it would happen like this, in front of hundreds of strangers, under banners stitched with a wolf crest that was not her own. The doors opened, and there he was. Alpha King Draven Voss stood at the top of the stone steps, tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in black and silver, his eyes the pale gray of a winter sky before snow. He did not smile. He did not move toward her the way mates were supposed to when the bond finally clicked into place. He simply stared, his jaw tight, his hands curled at his sides like he was holding something back. Lyra felt the pull immediately, a warm thread stretching from her chest toward him, undeniable and instinctive. She took a step forward without meaning to, her feet moving before her mind caught up. The hall buzzed with hushed voices. Nobles leaned toward each other. Someone gasped softly. She barely heard any of it. All she could feel was the invisible cord tightening between her and the man on the steps. He did not step down to meet her. "Stop," Draven said, and his voice cut through the hall like a blade through silk. Lyra froze mid-step, one hand still lifted slightly toward him, as if her body refused to accept what her ears had just heard. "I reject this bond," he said, louder now, so the entire hall could hear it clearly. "She is not fit to stand beside a king." The silence that followed was the loudest thing Lyra had ever experienced. It rang in her ears, pressed against her chest, made the edges of her vision blur for one dizzying second. She had heard stories of rejection before, whispered in corners, spoken about in hushed, pitying tones. She never thought she would become one of those stories herself, especially not like this, not in front of an entire kingdom. Her mind scrambled to make sense of it. She was an Omega from a modest pack, yes, without the noble bloodlines that filled this hall, but she had trained herself in herbal medicine, had learned to read and write better than most nobles bothered to, had built a quiet reputation for competence in a world that rarely noticed Omegas at all. None of that seemed to matter now. Not against the word unworthy, spoken so easily, so publicly, by the very man the universe had chosen for her. She could feel every eye in the hall on her, waiting for her to cry, waiting for her to beg, waiting for the collapse that always came after a rejection like this, the sobbing, the pleading, the desperate reach for a bond that had just been severed in front of witnesses. She could see it in their faces, that hungry anticipation for a show of weakness they could gossip about for months. Something inside Lyra went very quiet instead. It was not calm exactly. It was more like the stillness right before a storm breaks, when the air goes heavy and the birds stop singing. She felt the ache of the rejection settle deep in her chest, sharp and real, but she did not let it reach her face. She would not give them the performance they wanted. She lowered her hands slowly. She straightened her spine, and then, with a composure that surprised even herself, she bowed once, formally, the way tradition demanded when a king spoke. "As you wish, Alpha King," she said, her voice steady, carrying just far enough for the front rows to hear it clearly. Then she turned and walked out of the hall. She did not run. She did not stumble. She walked at a measured pace, her chin level, her shoulders back, past rows of nobles who had clearly expected something else entirely. She could feel their confusion following her like a second shadow, whispers rising in her wake, but she did not turn around. She kept walking until the cold night air of the courtyard hit her face, and only then did her hands begin to tremble. She pressed them flat against her sides and forced them still. Behind her, inside the hall, Draven remained frozen on the steps, watching the doors close behind the Omega he had just humiliated in front of his entire court. He had expected tears. He had expected her to crumble, the way rejected mates always did, giving him the closure of watching the bond die completely, witnessed and finished. Instead, he was left standing there with the echo of her calm voice ringing in his ears, and a strange, hollow feeling opening up in his chest that he refused to name. His beta, A broad-shouldered wolf named Marcus stepped up beside him, frowning slightly. "That is not usually how it goes," Marcus said quietly, careful to keep his voice low enough that only the king could hear. Draven said nothing. His eyes were still fixed on the closed doors, as if he expected her to walk back through them. "My king," Marcus tried again. "The court is watching you." Draven blinked, seeming to remember where he was, and turned to face the hall with a hard, unreadable expression. "Then let them watch," he said, and his voice had none of the confidence it usually carried. He turned and left through a side door without another word, leaving his advisors and nobles murmuring behind him, already spinning the story into something they would tell for years. Outside, in the courtyard, Lyra stood beneath a leafless tree, breathing slowly, deliberately, the way she had trained herself to breathe when treating patients in pain, in and out, steady, controlled. She would not let this moment break her, not here, not where anyone might still be watching from a window above. She thought of her home pack, small and modest, tucked along the eastern border where the land was rockier and the winters longer. She thought of her mother, who had always told her that an Omega's worth was not decided by an Alpha's approval, no matter how much the world liked to pretend otherwise. She held on to those words now like a rope in dark water. A carriage was waiting to take rejected mates back to their home packs, a quiet tradition meant to spare them the indignity of walking out through the front gates in full view of the crowd. Lyra climbed into it without looking back at the castle, its towers dark and looming against the night sky. As the carriage began to move, she allowed herself exactly one breath of grief, a single shaking exhale that fogged briefly against the cold window glass. Then she pressed her palm flat against the glass, watching the castle shrink behind her, and made herself a quiet promise. She would not let this be the story of her life. She would not become the tragic Omega who wept over a king who saw her as beneath him. Somewhere far behind her, in a private chamber at the top of the castle, Draven Voss sat alone, with his head in his hands, his wolf pacing restlessly beneath his skin, for the first time in years, and he did not yet understand why. The carriage ride back to her home pack took most of the night, the wheels rattling over rough roads while Lyra sat with her hands folded tightly in her lap, watching the dark shapes of trees blur past the window. She did not sleep. Sleep felt impossible with her mind replaying the moment over and over. The sound of his voice saying the word unworthy, the silence of the hall, the weight of every stare pressed against her back as she walked out. By the time the carriage reached the modest gates of her home pack, the sky had begun to lighten into a pale gray dawn. The guard at the gate, a young wolf named Oliver who had grown up alongside her, looked at her with wide eyes as she stepped down from the carriage. "Lyra," he said, carefully, glancing at the empty seat beside her, as if half expecting to see a king. "What happened?" "He rejected me," she said simply, keeping her voice flat and even, in front of everyone. Oliver's face shifted through several emotions at once, shock, sympathy, and something like anger on her behalf. "That coward," he muttered, then seemed to catch himself, glancing around to see if anyone had heard. Lyra managed a small, tired smile. "Thank you for not asking me to relive it in detail." "You don't have to explain anything to me," Oliver said, falling into step beside her as she walked through the gate. "Come on, let's get you home before the whole pack wakes up and starts asking questions." But word traveled fast in small packs, faster than any carriage could outrun it. By the time Lyra reached her family's modest house at the edge of the village, she could already feel the shift in the air, the way conversations paused when she passed, the way eyes followed her with a mixture of pity and something closer to distaste. Rejected mates were seen as damaged in the eyes of many packs, as though the rejection itself proved some hidden flaw the universe had detected and the Alpha had simply confirmed. Her mother, Grace, opened the door before Lyra even reached it, her face already lined with worry. She pulled Lyra into a tight embrace without a single question, holding her the way she had when Lyra was small and scared of thunderstorms. "I heard," Grace said quietly. "News like that flies faster than any bird." Lyra let herself lean into her mother's shoulder for exactly a few seconds, allowing herself that much softness, before straightening and stepping back. "I'm all right," she said, and mostly meant it. But the following days proved harder than she expected. Her position within the pack, modest as it had always been, began to erode in small, quiet ways. The healer she had been apprenticing under grew suddenly busy whenever Lyra came to help, mentioning vaguely that perhaps it was best if she took some time to herself. Neighbors who used to greet her warmly now offered tight, uncomfortable smiles and hurried past. Even a distant cousin, once friendly, made a comment at a family gathering about how rejected mates sometimes carried bad luck with them, as though Lyra's grief was somehow contagious. She said nothing in response to any of it. She simply watched, quietly cataloging which doors were closing around her, and began to understand that staying here meant slowly shrinking into whatever small, pitied corner the pack decided to place her in. One evening, sitting at the kitchen table while her mother prepared a simple meal, Lyra finally spoke the thought that had been building inside her for days. "I need to leave," she said. Grace paused, a wooden spoon still in her hand, and turned to look at her daughter carefully. "Leave the pack?" "Leave everything," Lyra said. "The pack, the politics, all of it. I can't build a life here where everyone looks at me like I'm broken." Grace was quiet for a long moment, studying her daughter's face, seeing the same quiet determination that had always lived there, even as a child. "Where would you go?" "Ashenvale," Lyra said, the name arriving in her mind with sudden clarity. "It's a border city. Independent. No pack hierarchy controlling everything. I could start over there, use my knowledge of herbs and healing to build something of my own." "That's a long way from home," Grace said softly. "I think that's exactly why it might work," Lyra replied. Her mother studied her for another long moment, then nodded slowly, though her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Then you should go," she said. "You were never meant to shrink yourself for people who don't see your worth." Lyra left within the week, taking only what she could carry, a modest bag of clothes, her collection of herbal notes gathered over years of careful study, and the small amount of savings she had managed to set aside. She did not tell anyone besides her mother and Oliver, who insisted on walking her to the edge of the packlands himself. "You'll write to me," Oliver said, not quite a question. "When I'm settled," Lyra promised. "And if that king ever comes looking for you," Oliver added, a hint of protective anger returning to his voice, "you tell me first. I'll handle it." Lyra managed a real smile at that, the first genuine one in days. "I don't think he will," she said. "I don't think he even remembers my name." She turned and walked toward the road that led away from everything familiar, toward a city she had never seen, carrying with her a rejection that had cracked something open inside her, though not in the way anyone expected. Instead of breaking her down, it had cleared away everything she thought she needed, leaving only the parts of herself she was determined to build back up on her own terms. Behind her, though she could not have known it yet, the Alpha King, who had cast her aside, was already beginning to unravel in ways his own court could not explain. That first night away from everything she had ever known, Draven Voss sat alone in his private chamber, staring at a fire that had long since burned low, and felt something inside him twist in a way he did not recognize. He told himself it meant nothing. Rejections happened. Alphas across every kingdom occasionally rejected a bond for reasons of status, politics, or simple preference, and most moved on within weeks, their wolves settling back into ordinary rhythm. His wolf did not settle. It paced instead, restless and agitated, pressing against the edges of his control in a way it had not done since he was a much younger wolf, still learning to master his own instincts. He found himself standing at odd hours, pacing his own chamber floor, his mind circling back, again and again, to the image of her walking out of that hall, calm and unbothered, when every part of tradition said she should have been in pieces. He told himself her composure had been an act, a final scrap of pride before she inevitably broke down somewhere private. He told himself it did not matter either way. He had made his decision for good reasons. Reasons rooted in the pressures of his crown, the expectations of his council, the careful political calculations that came with choosing a mate who would one day stand beside him as queen. An omega from a modest, unremarkable pack, however capable she might privately be, offered him no alliances, no strengthened borders, no advantage against the neighboring kingdoms that had been circling Blackthorn's resources for years. It had been the practical choice, the strategic choice. So why could he not stop thinking about her? Marcus found him 3 days later, still unusually short-tempered, snapping at servants over trivial mistakes he normally would have overlooked entirely. When Marcus finally worked up the courage to ask if something was wrong, Draven only stared at him, with an expression that mixed frustration and something almost like confusion. I don't know, Draven admitted quietly, which was, in itself, unusual enough to alarm his oldest friend and advisor. Draven Voss always knew. He had built his entire reign on decisive, controlled leadership, on never appearing uncertain in front of his people. You rejected a bond, Marcus said carefully. It happens. Give it time. I know how it usually happens, Draven snapped, then immediately regretted the sharpness in his own voice. He rubbed a hand over his face, exhaling slowly. I know how it's supposed to feel afterward. Relief. Clarity. This isn't that. Marcus studied him for a long moment. What does it feel like then? Draven did not answer, because he genuinely did not have the words for the hollow, restless ache that had settled into his chest since that night, nor for the strange, persistent image of her calm face and steady voice that refused to leave his mind, no matter how hard he tried to push it away. He told himself it would pass. He was wrong. Ashenvale was nothing like the packlands Lyra had left behind. The border city sprawled along a wide river, its streets a patchwork of different pack markings and no pack markings at all. Wolves and humans moving freely among each other, without the rigid hierarchy she had grown up under. There were no packs here to whisper about her, no neighbors who already knew her story before she opened her mouth. For the first time in weeks, she felt like she could breathe without the weight of 100 watching eyes. She found a small room above an apothecary shop owned by an older woman named Clara, a sharp-eyed, no-nonsense wolf who had lived independently for decades and had little patience for pack drama of any kind. When Lyra explained, briefly and without detail, that she was looking for work and had experience with herbal medicine, Clara had simply looked her over once, asked her to identify a row of dried plants lined up on the counter, and hired her on the spot after Lyra got every single one correct. You know your herbs, Clara said, sounding almost surprised. Where did you train? My home pack's healer, Lyra said carefully, keeping her answer vague. I studied for years before I left. Clara did not push for more. In Ashenvale, people rarely did. Everyone here seemed to be running from something, some old story or old pack they had left behind, and there was an unspoken understanding that you did not dig into another person's past unless they offered it themselves. Lyra decided, within her first week, that she would not use her real name in the city. It was not a decision born from shame, but from a desire to build something entirely her own, unattached to the reputation of a rejected Omega. She began going by Liana, a name close enough to her own that she would not forget to answer to it, but different enough to feel like a fresh start. The work suited her better than she expected. She spent her days grinding herbs, mixing salves, and learning the specific ailments common to border city life. Injuries from labor work along the docks, illnesses that spread quickly through crowded tenements, the occasional wolf who came in quietly asking for something to calm restless nerves without admitting why their nerves needed calming in the first place. Lyra found she had a gift, not just for the herbs themselves, but for the people who came seeking help. She learned to read the things they did not say, the exhaustion behind a forced smile, the fear hiding beneath a request for a simple headache remedy. Word spread slowly at first, then faster. Within 2 months, people were asking for Liana by name, trusting her steady hands and quiet, careful manner over the louder claims of traveling healers who passed through the city selling miracle cures. Clara began giving her more responsibility, eventually letting her run the shop entirely, on days when Clara traveled to gather supplies from further towns. You have a good reputation building here, Clara told her one evening as they closed the shop together. People trust you. That's rare in a city like this. I just listen to them, Lyra said simply. That's rarer than you'd think, Clara replied. The independent wolves of Ashenvale, the ones who had left their packs for reasons of their own, the mateless, the rejected, the ones who simply preferred a life without alpha hierarchy dictating their every move, became her most loyal customers. She understood them in a way she could not fully explain, recognizing in their careful, guarded eyes the same quiet resilience she had cultivated in herself. Months passed this way, steady and purposeful. Lyra built a small life for herself, modest but entirely her own, free from the pity and judgment that had followed her in her home pack. She wrote occasionally to her mother, and to Oliver, careful letters that spoke of her work and her new city, without dwelling on the pain that had brought her there. She did not mention Draven Voss at all, not once, though she noticed the careful way her own mind avoided his name, like stepping around a bruise that had not fully healed. She told herself the ache had faded. Most days, she almost believed it. Meanwhile, far to the north, Blackthorn Kingdom was beginning to notice a change in its king that unsettled even the most steady among his advisors. Draven Voss had always been known for his controlled, decisive leadership, a king who weighed every decision carefully and rarely let emotion cloud his judgment. In the months since the rejection, that reputation had begun to crack in ways his council found increasingly difficult to ignore. He snapped at advisors over minor disagreements that would never have bothered him before. He canceled meetings at the last minute, then rescheduled them, just as abruptly. He spent long hours alone in his chamber, refusing visitors, and when he did emerge, his temper simmered just beneath the surface, ready to flare at the smallest provocation. Marcus, ever loyal, tried repeatedly to address it, though every attempt ended the same way, with Draven insisting nothing was wrong, while visibly proving otherwise. "You need to eat something," Marcus said one evening, finding the king still at his desk, long after the dinner hour had passed, a stack of untouched reports scattered in front of him. "I'm working," Draven said flatly, not looking up. "You've been staring at the same page for 20 minutes. Draven's jaw tightened. "Then perhaps you should let me finish reading it." Marcus sighed and pulled up a chair uninvited, sitting across from the king, with the ease of someone who had known him since childhood and refused to be intimidated by royal titles. "This isn't like you, Draven. Something is wrong, and it started the night you rejected that Omega." At the mention of her, Draven's hand curled into a fist against the desk, though he seemed to notice the reaction only after Marcus's eyes flicked toward it. He forced his hand open again, flattening his palm against the wood. "It has nothing to do with her," he said, though his voice lacked its usual conviction. "Doesn't it?" Marcus pressed gently. "Your wolf hasn't settled since that night. Everyone can see it, even if no one dares say it to your face." Draven finally looked up, and for a brief moment, the exhaustion in his eyes was impossible to hide. Deep circles carved beneath them, a hollow, haunted look that had no business existing on the face of a king who had everything a kingdom could offer. "I made the right decision," Draven said, though it sounded more like he was trying to convince himself than Marcus. "She had no standing, no alliances to offer, nothing that would strengthen this kingdom against the threats gathering at our borders. It was the practical choice." "Practical," Marcus repeated slowly. "And yet here you are, unable to sleep, unable to focus, snapping at anyone who so much as looks at you wrong. Tell me honestly, does that sound like a wolf who made peace with his choice?" Draven did not answer, because he had no answer that did not sound hollow, even to himself. The weeks that followed only worsened. Draven began losing his temper in front of his own guards, something almost unheard of for a king who had always prided himself on measured authority. He contradicted decisions he had made only days earlier, confusing his council and sowing quiet doubt among the nobles who depended on his steady leadership to feel secure in their own positions. Rumors began circulating through the castle halls, careful whispers about the king's unpredictable moods, about a wolf that seemed to be slipping its careful chains. He knew, somewhere beneath the frustration and denial, exactly what was happening. A rejected bond was supposed to sever cleanly, allowing both wolves involved to move forward separately, their instincts eventually settling into new patterns. But the old stories, the ones his grandmother used to tell him as a child, spoke of something different when the bond in question was a true fated match, the rarest and strongest kind. In those cases, rejection did not sever the bond at all. It only wounded it, leaving both wolves tethered to an ache neither could fully explain nor escape. He refused to believe his bond with Lyra had been anything so rare. It was easier to believe he had simply made an error in judgment, one his pride would eventually help him move past. His wolf disagreed entirely, and its restlessness only grew louder with each passing week, pressing against his control in ways that frightened him more than he would ever admit aloud. Then, 6 months after the rejection, a formal letter arrived from the border territories, requesting a royal envoy to negotiate new trade agreements in the independent city of Ashenvale. Marcus brought the letter to Draven's study, expecting the king to delegate the matter to a lesser official, as he usually did with routine border negotiations. Instead, Draven read the letter twice, his expression unreadable, before setting it down carefully on his desk. "I'll go myself," he said. Marcus blinked in surprise. "Yourself? That's unnecessary for a simple trade negotiation. Send an envoy," I said I'll go myself, Draven repeated, his tone leaving no room for argument, though even he could not have explained the sudden, urgent pull he felt toward a city he had never once visited in his entire reign. Marcus studied him carefully, something clicking into place behind his eyes, though he wisely chose not to voice the thought aloud. As you wish, my king, he said instead. I'll prepare the arrangements. Draven nodded, already turning back toward the window, his gaze fixed on the horizon to the south, toward a city, where an Omega healer known only as Liana had spent the last 6 months building a life entirely free of the king who had once cast her aside, unaware that the very thread she thought had gone silent was about to pull taut again. The royal envoy arrived in Ashenvale on a gray morning, banners of black and silver catching the wind above a procession of guards and carriages that drew curious stares from the city's usually unbothered residents. Lyra was in the shop, grinding a batch of dried chamomile for a shipment heading to the docks, when Clara returned from the market with news that practically vibrated off her. The Alpha King himself is here, Clara said, setting down her basket with unusual excitement. Blackthorn's king, negotiating trade terms with the city council. Can you imagine? A king bothering to show up in person for something an envoy could handle. Lyra's hands went still over the mortar and pestle, her heart giving one hard, unwelcome lurch before she forced herself to breathe normally. That is unusual, she managed, keeping her voice carefully neutral. They say he'll be meeting with council members all week, Clara continued, unaware of the sudden tension gripping her assistant. Probably staying at the merchant quarter's finest inn. Half the city is already talking about it. Lyra nodded and returned to her grinding, though her hands moved more mechanically now, her mind racing through possibilities. Ashenvale was a large city. There was no reason their paths would cross. She had built an entirely different name for herself here, a different rhythm of life, tucked away in a modest apothecary shop that a king would have no reason to visit. She almost believed that logic, right up until 3 days later, when a guard from the royal envoy arrived at the shop's door, asking urgently for a healer to attend to a member of the king's party who had fallen seriously ill overnight. Clara was away gathering supplies from a neighboring town, leaving Lyra as the only healer available. She hesitated only a moment before grabbing her bag of herbs and following the guard, reminding herself firmly that treating a sick guard was nothing to fear, regardless of whose banner he served under. The inn where the royal party was staying buzzed with quiet tension when she arrived, servants moving briskly through the halls, voices low and urgent. She was led to a room where a young guard lay pale and sweating, clearly suffering from some kind of severe stomach ailment, likely from contaminated food or water along their journey. Lyra worked quickly and efficiently, exactly as she had trained herself to do, mixing a tonic to settle his stomach and reduce the fever that had begun creeping into his skin. She spoke to him gently, asking questions about his symptoms, checking his pulse with steady, practiced hands. She did not notice the tall figure standing in the doorway until his voice broke the quiet rhythm of her work. How is he? Lyra's hands paused for the briefest moment before continuing their work, though every instinct in her body had gone taut and alert. She recognized that voice instantly, low and controlled, though carrying an edge of exhaustion she had never heard in it before. She did not turn around immediately, using the extra seconds to steady her own expression before facing him. When she finally looked up, Draven Voss stood in the doorway, dressed more simply than she remembered from that night in the Grand Hall, his black and silver formal robes replaced with a plain traveling coat, though nothing could hide the authority in his posture. His pale gray eyes moved over her with polite, distant interest, the look of a king assessing an unfamiliar healer, nothing more. He did not recognize her. Relief and something oddly close to hurt tangled together in Lyra's chest at that realization. She kept her expression carefully composed, dipping her head in a brief, respectful nod. He'll recover within a day or two, Alpha King. It's a stomach ailment, likely from something he ate along the road. I've given him something to settle it and reduce the fever. You're certain? Draven asked, stepping further into the room, his gaze sharpening slightly with the natural authority of someone used to demanding thorough answers. I'm certain, Lyra said evenly, returning her attention to her patient, rather than lingering under the king's scrutiny. Keep him hydrated, and have him avoid solid food until tomorrow evening. He should be back on his feet within 2 days. Something in her tone, perhaps the quiet, unwavering confidence of it, made Draven pause. He studied her more closely, his brow furrowing slightly, though he could not have said exactly why her voice tugged at something unfamiliar in the back of his mind. She kept her face angled slightly away, her simple healer's clothing, and the herbal scent clinging to her skin, masking the deeper layer of her scent that might otherwise have given her away instantly. "You're not from the Royal Healers Guild," Draven observed, his tone more curious than commanding now. "Your methods are different. I trained independently," Lyra said, packing her supplies back into her bag with brisk, efficient movements, eager to conclude this encounter before her composure wavered any further. "Ashenvale has its own traditions of medicine, separate from the noble packs." "And your name?" Draven asked. Lyra hesitated for exactly one heartbeat too long before answering. "Liana," she said. "I run the apothecary near the river district." Draven nodded slowly, something in his expression thoughtful, almost searching, though he clearly could not place why this healer's calm, steady presence unsettled him in a way he could not name. "Thank you for your help, Liana," he said finally. "The kingdom of Blackthorn is in your debt." "There's no debt," Lyra said simply. "It's my work." She left the inn as quickly as propriety allowed, her heart hammering against her ribs the entire walk back to the apothecary shop, equal parts relief that he had not recognized her, and a strange, unwelcome ache at how easily he had looked past her, without a single flicker of recognition. But fate, it seemed, was not finished with them yet. Over the following days, the royal envoy's business kept Draven in Ashenvale far longer than the original negotiations required, delays and complications arising one after another, in ways that felt almost deliberately designed to keep him in the city. He found himself, more than once, walking through the river district on business that could easily have been handled by his advisors, his feet carrying him toward the apothecary shop, under the guise of checking on his recovering guard's progress. Each visit, he told himself it was simple courtesy, a king, ensuring his people were properly cared for. Each visit, he lingered a few minutes longer than necessary, watching Liana move through her shop with quiet efficiency, answering his questions about various herbs and remedies with patient, thoughtful explanations that reminded him, in ways he could not quite place, of someone he was trying very hard not to think about. Lyra, for her part, maintained careful distance, keeping their interactions strictly professional, though she noticed the way his presence seemed to fill the small shop entirely, the way her wolf stirred restlessly beneath her calm exterior every time he stepped through the door. She told herself repeatedly that this was simply proximity to an alpha, nothing more, a natural instinctive response that meant nothing about her actual feelings. She was lying to herself, and some quiet part of her knew it. The breaking point came nearly 2 weeks into his stay, on an evening when Clara had already closed the shop and gone home, leaving Lyra alone to finish organizing a fresh shipment of dried herbs. A soft knock at the door made her look up, expecting perhaps a late customer, only to find Draven standing there once more, his expression troubled in a way she had not seen before. "I apologize for the late hour," he said, stepping inside at her nod. "I wanted to ask you something, if you don't mind." "Of course," Lyra said, setting down the bundle of herbs in her hands, though her instincts prickled with sudden wariness at the unusual seriousness in his voice. "Your scent," Draven said slowly, seeming to choose his words carefully. "It's familiar to me, though I cannot place why. Have we met before, somewhere outside of Ashenvale?" Lyra's heart stuttered painfully in her chest. She kept her expression carefully neutral, though her mind raced through every possible response, weighing the risk of the truth against the exhaustion of continuing this careful, elaborate lie. "I don't believe we have," she said finally, her voice steadier than she felt. Draven studied her for a long moment, his pale gray eyes searching her face with an intensity that made her skin prickle uncomfortably. "Perhaps I'm mistaken," he said slowly, though his tone suggested he did not fully believe his own words. He left shortly after, and Lyra stood alone in the darkened shop for a long time afterward, her hands trembling slightly, as she finally allowed herself to acknowledge the obvious truth. Their bond, though rejected, had never fully severed, and sooner or later, he was going to figure out exactly who she was. The recognition, when it finally came, arrived not through careful investigation, but through pure accident, the way truth often finds its way to the surface, no matter how carefully it has been buried. 3 days after their strange, unsettling conversation in the shop, Lyra was called once again to attend to a patient at the Merchant Quarters Inn. this time a minor noble in the king's traveling party, who had twisted his ankle badly on the uneven cobblestones outside. She arrived with her usual bag of supplies, moving through the familiar halls of the inn with practiced efficiency, her mind focused entirely on the task ahead. She did not notice, until it was far too late, that her hurried movements had loosened the leather cord holding back her hair, sending it tumbling free around her shoulders, in a way she rarely allowed in public. She also did not notice, in her haste, that she had brushed directly past Draven Voss, in the narrow hallway outside the injured noble's room, close enough that her unbound hair swept briefly across his arm. It was enough. The scent that had been carefully masked beneath herbal oils and the general business of a healer's work hit him fully and unmistakably in that single, unguarded moment, stripped of every distraction that had kept the truth hidden for 2 weeks. Draven froze completely, his entire body going rigid, his breath catching sharply in his throat. Lyra felt him stop and turned back instinctively, only to find him staring at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before. Shock and dawning horror tangled together so completely that for a moment neither of them spoke at all. "Lyra," he said, and her name in his voice, spoken with such raw disbelief, felt like a physical blow. She could have denied it. She could have insisted he was mistaken, invented some excuse, walked away, and preserved the careful distance she had built for herself. But standing there in the narrow hallway, watching the color drain from his face, as the truth settled fully into place, she found she no longer had the energy for the elaborate lie. "Hello, Draven," she said quietly instead, using his given name rather than his title for the first time, a small act of defiance that felt strangely important in that moment. He looked as though the floor had shifted beneath him. "You're Liana," he said slowly, as if trying to reconcile two entirely separate people into one. "You've been here this whole time, in Ashenvale. I've been coming to your shop for 2 weeks." "I have," Lyra confirmed simply. "Why didn't you tell me?" His voice cracked slightly on the question, an unfamiliar vulnerability breaking through his usual composed authority. Lyra straightened her spine, meeting his gaze directly for the first time since that terrible night in the Grand Hall. "Because you made it very clear, in front of your entire court, exactly how little you thought of me," she said, her voice steady, despite the storm of emotion churning beneath it. "I saw no reason to volunteer that information to a king who had already decided I was unworthy of his time." Draven flinched visibly at her words, the accusation landing exactly where she had intended it to. "That's not," he started, then stopped, running a hand through his hair in obvious frustration. "That's not entirely what happened." "Isn't it?" Lyra asked, her tone sharpening slightly despite her best efforts to remain calm. "I remember quite clearly. You said I was not fit to stand beside a king, in front of hundreds of witnesses." "I know what I said," Draven replied, his voice low and strained. "I've regretted it every single day since." The admission hung between them in the quiet hallway, and for a moment, neither of them seemed to know what to do with it. Lyra studied his face carefully, searching for the arrogance she remembered from that night, but finding instead something closer to exhaustion, a weariness that seemed to have settled deep into his bones. "I need to finish treating my patient," she said finally, stepping around him carefully. "We can discuss this another time, if you insist on discussing it at all." "Lyra, wait," Draven said, reaching out instinctively, before catching himself, and letting his hand fall back to his side. "Not now," she said firmly, and continued down the hallway, toward the injured noble's room, leaving Draven standing alone in the corridor, with the full weight of 6 months of denial, finally collapsing around him. That night, Draven did not sleep at all. He paced his chambers restlessly, his wolf finally, fully settled for the first time since the rejection, now that the bond had been confirmed and identified, rather than left to fester in vague, unnamed restlessness. But settled did not mean satisfied. If anything, the clarity only sharpened the ache, giving shape and name to a hunger that had been gnawing at him for months. He understood now, with painful clarity, exactly what the old stories his grandmother used to tell had meant. A rejected, fated bond did not simply disappear. It festered, quietly, relentlessly, refusing to release its hold no matter how firmly the rejecting wolf insisted otherwise. He had spent 6 months telling himself he had made a practical, strategic decision, only to discover that his own instincts had never once accepted that decision as final. He thought of every strange, restless night since the rejection, every flash of temper that had confused even himself. Every moment his advisors had watched him with quiet concern he had dismissed as unnecessary worry. It had all been this. All of it. The slow unraveling of a king who had rejected the one bond capable of settling him completely. By morning, Draven had made a decision. He would not let pride keep him from correcting the greatest mistake of his reign, regardless of what it cost him politically or personally. He sent word requesting a private audience with the healer known as Liana, though he suspected, correctly, that she would not answer to that name for much longer between the two of them. Lyra arrived at the appointed meeting place, a quiet garden behind the inn, her expression guarded but composed. She had spent the previous night turning the encounter over in her mind, examining her own feelings with the same careful precision she applied to diagnosing a patient's ailment. She was angry, yes, still carrying the sharp sting of a humiliation that had upended her entire life. But she was no longer the same Omega who had walked out of that grand hall 6 months ago, and she refused to let old wounds dictate how this next conversation unfolded. "You wanted to speak with me," she said, settling onto a stone bench across from where he stood, keeping a deliberate distance between them. "I owe you an explanation," Draven said, "and an apology, though I understand it may mean very little at this point." "Try me," Lyra said simply. Draven drew a slow breath, seeming to gather his thoughts carefully before speaking. "When I felt the bond snap into place that night, I panicked," he admitted, his voice quieter and more honest than she had ever heard it. "My father spent his entire reign making decisions based on emotion, on personal preference, and it nearly cost our kingdom everything during the border conflicts of his time. I swore I would never rule that way. When I saw you, an Omega from a small, unremarkable pack, my first instinct was fear. Fear that accepting the bond meant repeating my father's mistakes, choosing personal connection over strategic necessity." "So you rejected me to prove a point to yourself," Lyra said flatly. "I rejected you because I was afraid," Draven corrected. "And I told myself it was strategy, because that was easier to accept than admitting I was terrified of what accepting you might mean. I convinced myself the practical reasoning was sound. I ignored the part of myself that knew, the moment I saw you, that rejecting the bond would be the greatest mistake of my life." Lyra was quiet for a long moment, studying his face, searching for any trace of manipulation or performance in his words. She found none, only raw, uncomfortable honesty that seemed to cost him considerable pride to voice aloud. "You humiliated me in front of hundreds of people," she said finally. "You made me a cautionary tale, an example of what rejected Omegas endure. My own pack treated me differently after that, like I was somehow damaged. I had to leave everything I knew and build an entirely new life, just to escape the shadow of that single moment." "I know," Draven said, his voice heavy with something that sounded genuinely like shame. "And I have no right to ask you to forgive that, or to ask you to simply accept me now, because my own instincts have finally caught up to what I should have recognized from the beginning." "No," Lyra agreed. "You don't." The silence between them stretched long and uncomfortable, filled with everything neither of them quite knew how to say. Finally, Lyra rose from the bench, smoothing her simple healer's dress with steady hands. "I appreciate the apology," she said. "I do. But an apology doesn't erase 6 months of rebuilding my life from nothing, and it doesn't erase the reasons behind your original rejection. I need time to think about what any of this actually means, if it means anything at all." "Take whatever time you need," Draven said quickly. "I'm not asking for an immediate answer. I'm asking for a chance to prove that I've changed, that the wolf who rejected you in that hall is not the only version of me that exists." Lyra studied him for a long moment, then nodded once. A small, careful concession, rather than a promise. "We'll see," she said, and left the garden without looking back, leaving Draven alone, with the uncertain hope of a future he had no guarantee of earning. News of the king's continued presence in Ashenvale, far longer than any trade negotiation required, eventually reached Blackthorn's council, and their response was swift and pointed. A formal letter arrived within days, signed by 3 senior council members, expressing concern over the king's extended absence, and gently reminding him of pressing matters awaiting his attention at home, including renewed tensions along the northern border with the rival kingdom of Greyfell. Draven read the letter in his temporary quarters at the inn, Marcus standing nearby with his arms crossed, clearly having anticipated this exact development. They're worried, Marcus said simply. A king lingering in a border city with no clear diplomatic purpose raises questions, especially with Greyfell testing our borders again. I have purpose here, Draven said, setting the letter down with more force than necessary. I know, Marcus said carefully. But the council doesn't know about Lyra, and if they find out the reason you've stayed twice as long as any trade negotiation requires is a rejected Omega you're trying to win back, they will not react well. You know how they feel about emotional decisions after your father's reign. Draven's jaw tightened at the reminder. I'm not my father. No one is saying you are, Marcus replied gently. But perception matters, especially now. Greyfell has been testing our defenses for months, probing weaknesses at the border, and the council believes a strong strategic marriage, one that secures allied support from a neighboring pack, would strengthen our position considerably. They've already begun quietly discussing candidates. The words landed like a physical weight in Draven's chest. Candidates, he repeated flatly. Lady Diane of the Thornwood pack has been mentioned more than once, Marcus said, watching Draven's reaction carefully. Her pack controls key resources along the northern trade routes. A union there would strengthen our position against Greyfell considerably. Draven's hands curled into fists at his sides, his wolf bristling immediately at the mere suggestion. I already made that mistake once, he said, his voice low and dangerous. Choosing strategy over instinct nearly destroyed me. I won't make it again. The council may not give you a choice, Marcus said carefully. Not if they believe the kingdom's security depends on it. Draven stared out the window of his quarters, toward the river district where Lyra's apothecary shop stood, and felt something settle firmly into place inside him, a clarity he had been searching for since the moment he first felt her scent in that hallway. Then I'll have to make the choice clear before they attempt to make it for me, he said finally. He requested an emergency correspondence be sent to the council, informing them of his intentions, though he chose his words carefully, revealing only that he had identified a serious personal matter requiring resolution before his return, without yet naming Lyra directly. He knew the announcement, when it finally came, would need to be handled with precision, both for Lyra's protection and for the stability of his own reign. Meanwhile, tensions along the northern border continued escalating faster than anyone anticipated. Reports arrived of Greyfell scouts testing patrol routes, probing for weaknesses in Blackthorn's defenses, emboldened perhaps by rumors of their king's unusual absence and the uncertainty rippling through the court in his stead. Marcus grew increasingly anxious, torn between loyalty to his king and genuine concern for the kingdom's stability. You need to return soon, Marcus urged one evening, finding Draven once again staring out toward the river district. Whatever is happening between you and Lyra, it cannot wait indefinitely. Greyfell won't wait for you to sort out your personal matters. I know, Draven said quietly. I need to speak with her again, properly this time, not to ask for forgiveness, but to ask her to decide, honestly and without pressure, what she wants moving forward. He found Lyra the following afternoon at the apothecary shop, busy preparing a batch of remedies for a customer who had just left. She looked up as he entered, her expression guarded but not entirely closed off, a small improvement from their tense conversation in the garden days earlier. I need to return to Blackthorn soon, Draven said without preamble, deciding directness was the only fair approach left to him. There are tensions building at our northern border that require my attention, and my council has already begun discussing potential strategic marriages to strengthen our alliances against the threat. Lyra's expression flickered, something complicated passing behind her eyes before she carefully smoothed it away. I see, she said evenly. I don't want a strategic marriage, Draven continued, stepping closer, though he kept enough distance to respect the boundary she had drawn between them. I want you, Lyra, not because rejecting you left my wolf restless, though it did, but because every single conversation we've had these past weeks, even before I knew who you truly were, showed me exactly the kind of partner and queen you would be. Capable, thoughtful, honest, in ways most nobles in my court have long forgotten how to be. That's a beautiful speech, Lyra said, though her voice carried no bitterness, only careful consideration. But you rejected me once already, based on fear and strategic calculation. How do I know this isn't simply a different kind of strategic calculation now? One where accepting me happens to align conveniently with what your wolf wants. It was a fair question, and Draven took a long moment to consider his answer carefully, rather than rushing to defend himself. You don't know for certain, he admitted finally. I can't prove my intentions to you with words alone. All I can offer is this. If you choose to return to Blackthorn, it will not be as a rejected Omega quietly accepted back into favor. It will be as an equal, with conditions of your own choosing, with authority and respect that matches your actual worth, rather than the worth my court originally assumed you lacked. And if you choose not to return at all, I will accept that decision, and will not trouble you further, regardless of what it costs me personally or politically. Lyra studied him carefully, searching his face for any hint of insincerity, finding instead a rawness in his expression that matched the honesty of his words. She thought of everything she had built here in Ashenvale, the modest but meaningful life she had constructed entirely on her own terms, free from any king's approval or rejection. She thought of her mother's words, spoken so long ago, that an Omega's worth was never decided by an Alpha's judgment. She also thought of the bond itself, that quiet, persistent thread she had never fully managed to sever, no matter how firmly she told herself she had moved on. I need time to decide, she said finally. Not because I doubt what you've said today, but because I refuse to make this decision quickly, the way I nearly let myself be defined by your rejection all those months ago. I built this life carefully, and I will decide its future just as carefully. That's fair, Draven said, and meant it. Take whatever time you need. I'll wait for your answer, however long it takes. He returned to Blackthorn 3 days later, leaving Lyra alone, with a decision that would shape not only her own future, but potentially, the future of an entire kingdom, standing at the edge of renewed conflict. For nearly 2 weeks after Draven's departure, Lyra continued her work at the apothecary shop, though her mind wandered constantly to the decision awaiting her. She spoke with Clara about it eventually, choosing to share the truth of her identity and history, now that so much had already shifted beneath the surface of her carefully built life. Clara listened without interrupting, her expression thoughtful rather than shocked. I always wondered why a healer with your skill chose to hide herself away in a border city, she said once Lyra finished explaining. Now it makes sense. I don't know what to do, Lyra admitted, twisting a dried sprig of lavender between her fingers absently. Part of me wants to refuse entirely, to prove that I don't need his approval or his crown to have a meaningful life. But another part of me remembers the bond, the way it pulled at me from the very first moment, and wonders if walking away from that entirely is its own kind of running. Only you can decide that, Clara said gently. But for what it's worth, the wolf who came in here week after week to check on his guard, who lingered asking about herbs he clearly had no real need to know about, did not seem like a king performing strategy. He seemed like a man who couldn't quite stay away, even when he had every practical reason to. Lyra considered her friend's words carefully over the following days, weighing them against her own memories, both the sharp humiliation of that night in the Grand Hall, and the surprising, unguarded honesty she had witnessed from Draven since their reunion in Ashenvale. Her decision, however, was forced into urgency far sooner than she anticipated. Late one evening, as she prepared to close the shop, a stranger entered, his posture too stiff and formal for an ordinary customer, his scent unfamiliar and carrying the sharp, cold edge of northern territory she did not recognize. He wore no visible pack markings, though something in his bearing suggested military training rather than simple travel. "Are you the healer known as Liana?" he asked, his tone carefully polite, but carrying an undertone that immediately set Lyra's instincts on edge. "I am," she said cautiously, keeping the counter between them. "How can I help you?" "My name is not important," the stranger said, "but I bring a message from Greyfell's court. They are aware of the Alpha King's connection to you, and they believe it may prove useful in the ongoing negotiations regarding the northern border dispute." Lyra's blood ran cold. "I have no connection to any negotiations," she said carefully, her mind racing. "Perhaps not directly," the stranger said, his tone remaining unsettlingly calm. "But Greyfell's council believes King Draven's evident attachment to you represents a vulnerability worth exploring, should diplomatic negotiations fail to produce favorable terms. I am simply here to inform you that your safety in this city is no longer guaranteed, should tensions between our kingdoms escalate further." "Are you threatening me?" Lyra asked, keeping her voice steady despite the sudden pounding of her heart. "I am informing you," the stranger corrected smoothly, that decisions made far from Ashenvale may soon have consequences that reach directly into your life here, regardless of whether you consider yourself involved in kingdom politics. He left as abruptly as he had arrived, leaving Lyra standing alone in the shop, her hands trembling slightly as she processed the implications of what had just occurred. She locked the door immediately after his departure, her mind racing through the sudden, unwelcome realization that her careful separation from Draven's world had never truly protected her at all. The bond itself, known now to at least one rival kingdom, had made her a target regardless of her own choices. She sent word to Draven that same night, using the fastest courier the city offered, describing the encounter in careful, precise detail. Draven received the message 2 days later, and the reaction it provoked in him was immediate and absolute. He called Marcus into his chambers within minutes of reading it, his expression harder and more focused than it had been in the entire 6 months since the rejection. "Greyfell has threatened her," Draven said, his voice dangerously quiet. "They know about the bond, and they intend to use her as leverage in the border negotiations." Marcus read the letter quickly, his expression darkening. "This changes things considerably," he said. "If Greyfell believes they can exploit a personal vulnerability, they may escalate their border testing specifically to draw out a reaction." "I'm not leaving her exposed," Draven said, already moving toward the door. "I'm sending a full guard contingent to Ashenvale immediately, and I'm going myself." "Draven," Marcus said carefully, using his given name rather than his title, a habit reserved for moments requiring his oldest friend's full attention, rather than a subject's deference. "If you go rushing to Ashenvale now, publicly, with a full guard contingent, you confirm exactly what Greyfell suspects. You hand them the leverage they're hoping for." Draven paused, forcing himself to think through the tactical implications, despite the urgent, protective fury pulsing through him. "Then what do you suggest?" "Announce the bond publicly. Immediately. Here in Blackthorn. Before Greyfell can use secrecy against you," Marcus said. "If the entire kingdom, and by extension Greyfell's spies, know that Lyra is your acknowledged, chosen mate, under full royal protection, threatening her becomes a direct act of war, rather than a quiet, deniable pressure tactic. Secrecy is the only thing giving them leverage right now. Remove it, and you remove their advantage." Draven considered this carefully, understanding immediately the soundness of the strategy, despite every instinct urging him to rush to Ashenvale without delay. "You're right," he said finally, "but I need her consent before making any public announcement. I promised her the choice would be hers, freely made, not forced by circumstance or danger. Then send for her immediately, under heavy guard, and let her make that choice, with full knowledge of what's at stake," Marcus said. "But do it quickly. Every day of delay gives Greyfell more room to act." Draven dispatched a heavily guarded escort to Ashenvale within the hour, along with a personal letter explaining the situation in full detail, and requesting, rather than demanding, that Lyra return to Blackthorn under royal protection, to make her decision with complete safety and full information available to her. Lyra read the letter carefully, sitting alone in her small room above the apothecary shop, weighing the sudden, unwelcome reality that her choice was no longer purely personal. Whatever she decided now carried consequences beyond her own life, touching the stability of 2 kingdoms and the safety of countless people who had nothing to do with the bond she had once tried so hard to escape. She thought of her mother's words once more, that her worth was never meant to be decided by anyone else's judgment, but she also recognized, with clear-eyed honesty, that refusing to act now was itself a choice, one that left her vulnerable to forces entirely outside her control. She packed her bag within the hour, said a careful goodbye to Clara, who hugged her tightly, and made her promise to write regardless of what she ultimately decided, and departed for Blackthorn, under the heavy escort Draven had provided, her heart pounding with a complicated mixture of fear, determination, and something she was finally ready to acknowledge as hope. The journey back to Blackthorn felt entirely different from the carriage ride that had once carried Lyra away from it in disgrace. This time, she rode surrounded by a full contingent of royal guards, their formation tight and alert, clearly prepared for any potential threat along the road. She watched the passing countryside through the carriage window, the same rocky hills and dense forests she remembered from her original journey, though now everything felt charged with a different kind of tension entirely. One of the guards, a steady, quiet wolf named Nathan, who had been assigned to lead her personal escort, rode close beside her carriage for most of the journey, occasionally checking in on her comfort with polite, professional concern. "You've been quiet, my lady," Nathan observed during one of their brief stops to rest the horses. "I have a great deal to think about," Lyra admitted, accepting a offered cup of water gratefully. "For what it's worth," Nathan said carefully, "the entire castle has been different since word of your existence reached the guard barracks. The king has been difficult these past months. Short-tempered, distracted. Most of us assumed it was simply the pressures of ruling. Learning the truth explained a great deal." Lyra considered this information carefully, filing it away alongside everything else she had learned about Draven's unraveling since the rejection. It was one thing to hear it from Marcus, or from Draven himself, both of whom had clear reasons to frame the narrative favorably. Hearing it from an ordinary guard, with no particular stake in the outcome, carried a different kind of weight. "Thank you for telling me," she said simply. They reached the outskirts of Blackthorn Kingdom by late afternoon on the second day, the familiar towers of the castle rising against the horizon, exactly as Lyra remembered them from that terrible night 6 months earlier. Her stomach tightened with a complicated mixture of old pain and new uncertainty, as the carriage rolled through the same gates she had once walked through with such hopeful anticipation, only to leave in humiliated silence hours later. Draven was waiting in the courtyard when her carriage finally arrived, his expression tense with obvious relief the moment he spotted her stepping down from the vehicle, safe and unharmed. He did not rush forward, respecting the careful distance she had maintained between them since their reunion in Ashenvale, though every line of his body seemed to strain toward closing that gap. "You came," he said simply. "You asked me to make this choice with full information," Lyra replied. "I couldn't do that from Ashenvale, not with Greyfell's threat hanging over both of us." Draven nodded, understanding the careful boundary in her words, the acknowledgement that her presence here did not yet constitute an answer. "Marcus has prepared quarters for you, separate from mine, with full guard protection. Whatever you decide, you'll be safe here while you decide it." "Thank you," Lyra said, and meant it. She spent the following 2 days observing the castle and its people, with careful, deliberate attention, testing the truth of everything she had been told against the reality unfolding around her. She noticed the way servants spoke of the king with clear concern, careful references to his difficult moods over recent months, that softened considerably now that speculation about the reason had begun quietly circulating through castle gossip. She noticed the way Marcus watched Draven, with the relieved expression of a man who had been genuinely worried about his friend's well-being, not merely his political stability. She also requested, and received, a private meeting with several council members, curious to understand firsthand the political pressures Draven had described. The meeting proved illuminating in ways she had not fully anticipated. "I'll speak plainly, my lady," said an older council member named Henry, his expression grave but not unkind. "The council has genuine concerns about the northern border situation with Greyfell. We believed, until recently, that a strategic marriage represented our best path toward securing stronger regional alliances. Learning of the king's existing bond has complicated that assessment considerably, though I confess, watching his behavior these past months, I now understand we may have been pushing him toward a decision that would have caused far greater instability than any strategic marriage could resolve." "You're saying the council no longer opposes the bond?" Lyra asked carefully. "I'm saying the council recognizes, perhaps belatedly, that a king operating at half capacity, due to an unresolved rejected bond, serves this kingdom far worse than a king fully settled and functioning, regardless of his mate's original standing," Henry replied honestly. "Your reputation as a skilled healer, capable of independent success in a competitive border city, speaks favorably to your character as well. We initially judged you based on your pack's modest standing. That judgment, I now believe, was short-sighted." The conversation offered Lyra a clearer picture than she had expected of the genuine shift occurring within Blackthorn's court, a recognition that the original rejection had been born from fear and flawed political calculation, rather than any accurate assessment of her actual worth. That evening, Draven requested a private audience with her in the castle gardens, the same gardens, she realized with a strange pang, where nobles had once gathered to watch the fated bond ceremony that had ended so disastrously months earlier. "I've spoken with several council members," Lyra said, once they were settled on a stone bench overlooking the quiet gardens. They seemed to have reconsidered their original position considerably. They have, Draven confirmed. Watching me struggle these past months convinced them, better than any argument I could have made myself, that rejecting the bond served none of us well. But I want to be clear, Lyra. Whatever the Council believes now, my request for you to consider returning is not born from their approval. It's born from the simple, undeniable truth that I made an enormous mistake, and I want the chance to correct it properly, with you as an equal partner, rather than a rejected afterthought welcomed back only once it became politically convenient. Lyra studied his face carefully in the fading evening light, searching once more for any trace of performance or calculation, finding instead the same raw honesty she had witnessed throughout their recent encounters. If I agree to this, she said slowly, it will be under specific conditions. I will not simply slot back into the role you originally imagined for a queen, quiet and decorative, deferring entirely to your judgment. I have built skills and independence these past 6 months that I have no intention of abandoning. I want to continue practicing medicine, formally, with recognized standing, rather than quiet tolerance. I want a genuine voice in decisions that affect this kingdom, not merely ceremonial presence at your side. Agreed, Draven said immediately, without hesitation. All of it. I don't want the quiet, decorative queen my father's court once imagined either. I want a partner capable of challenging my judgment when necessary. Someone whose competence and independence make this kingdom stronger, not merely someone who exists to fill a role beside the throne. Lyra allowed herself a small, genuine smile at that, the first she had offered him since her calm departure from that fateful hall 6 months earlier. Then I have one more condition, she said. Name it. Whatever announcement you make regarding this bond, it must include a full and public acknowledgement of your original rejection, and an explanation that the fault lay entirely with your own fear and flawed judgment, not with any deficiency on my part. I will not have the kingdom quietly assume I simply forgave an unexplained slight. They will understand exactly what happened, and exactly why it was wrong. Draven nodded slowly, understanding the depth of what she was asking, the vulnerability it would require of him to stand before his entire court and openly admit fault rather than allowing the narrative to soften with time and convenient silence. I'll make that announcement, he said, gladly, and without hesitation. You deserve nothing less. The formal announcement was scheduled for 3 days later, giving the castle staff enough time to prepare the grand hall, while also allowing word to spread naturally through the kingdom, ensuring the announcement would reach as many ears as possible, including, Draven hoped, whatever spies Greyfell had embedded within Blackthorn's borders. Lyra spent those 3 days in careful preparation of her own, though not in the way court tradition typically demanded for a returning mate. Rather than focusing entirely on appearance and ceremony, she spent considerable time reviewing Blackthorn's current medical practices, meeting with the castle's head healer, an aging wolf named Oliver Fenwick, who bore no relation to her childhood friend back home, and discussing potential improvements to how the kingdom trained and organized its healers. You have unusual priorities for someone preparing to become queen, Fenwick observed during one of their meetings, though his tone carried more curiosity than criticism. I intend to be a queen who uses her actual skills rather than simply performing a role, Lyra replied. If I'm returning to this position, it will be as someone who contributes meaningfully to this kingdom, not merely someone who exists decoratively beside its king. Fenwick studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly, something like respect settling into his expression. Then I look forward to working alongside you, my lady. This kingdom's healing practices have grown stagnant under old traditions that could use exactly the kind of fresh perspective you seem to offer. Meanwhile, reports continued arriving from the northern border, each one carrying increasingly concerning news. Greyfell scouts had grown bolder, testing patrol routes more aggressively, and diplomatic correspondence between the two kingdoms had taken on a noticeably sharper tone in recent days. Marcus grew visibly tense as the day of the announcement approached, aware that Greyfell's spies would likely relay news of the public bond acknowledgement almost immediately. Are we certain this is the right approach? Marcus asked, Draven privately, the night before the announcement, both of them reviewing border reports spread across the war room table. Making this public removes Greyfell's leverage regarding secrecy, but it also confirms directly what they suspected, that you have a personal vulnerability they might still attempt to exploit through other means. There's no version of this where Lyra remains completely safe from political maneuvering, Draven said honestly. The only real choice is between a version where she's hidden and vulnerable to secret leverage, or a version where she's publicly acknowledged, protected, and respected as my chosen mate, with the full weight of this kingdom's guard and reputation behind her. I choose the second option, regardless of how Greyfell reacts. Marcus nodded slowly, though concern still lingered in his expression. Then we increase security around the castle and the border simultaneously. If Greyfell decides to escalate in response to this announcement, we need to be prepared for that possibility. Already arranged, Draven confirmed. Additional guards have been positioned along the northern patrol route since yesterday morning. The day of the announcement arrived with unusual clarity. A bright, cold morning that seemed to sharpen every color in the castle courtyard, as nobles and dignitaries began arriving for the formal gathering. Lyra dressed carefully that morning, choosing a simple but elegant gown in deep green, rather than the elaborate, ornate styles typically favored by Blackthorn's court, a deliberate choice that reflected her own preferences, rather than an attempt to perform a role that had never truly suited her. She met Draven briefly before the ceremony began, both of them standing quietly in a private antechamber while the sounds of gathering nobles filtered through the walls beyond. "Are you ready?" Draven asked, studying her face carefully for any sign of hesitation. "Are you?" Lyra countered. "This announcement requires you to publicly admit fault in front of the same court that watched you reject me 6 months ago. That's not an easy thing for any king to do. I've had 6 months to sit with the consequences of my original decision," Draven said quietly. "Admitting fault publicly is nothing compared to the cost of continuing to pretend that decision was ever justified." They entered the grand hall together, walking side by side, rather than the formal, separated procession tradition typically demanded, another small but deliberate departure from the ceremonial expectations that had governed their first, disastrous encounter in this same space. The hall fell silent almost immediately, hundreds of eyes tracking their movement with obvious, barely contained curiosity, word having clearly spread already regarding the general nature of today's announcement. Draven stopped at the top of the same stone steps where he had once rejected Lyra so publicly, though this time she stood directly beside him rather than waiting below, an equal presence rather than a supplicant awaiting judgment. 6 months ago, Draven began, his voice carrying clearly through the silent hall. "I stood in this exact place and rejected a fated bond in front of this entire court. I told the Omega standing before me that she was unfit to stand beside a king. I was wrong, in every possible sense of that word." A ripple of quiet murmurs moved through the assembled nobles, though Draven continued without pause, his voice steady despite the vulnerability of the admission. "I rejected Lyra Ashwood out of fear, not strategy, though I told myself otherwise at the time. I feared that accepting an Omega from a modest pack meant repeating decisions my own father made, decisions rooted in emotion rather than careful judgment. I was wrong about that as well. Lyra Ashwood is among the most capable, thoughtful people I have ever encountered. A skilled healer who built an entirely independent life and reputation in the 6 months since my rejection, without any assistance or protection from this crown. My original judgment of her worth was short-sighted and unjust, and I stand here today to correct that mistake publicly, exactly as publicly as I made it." He turned to face Lyra directly, his expression open in a way that left no room for doubt regarding the sincerity of his words. "I am formally and permanently reversing my rejection of this bond," he said, his voice carrying clearly to every corner of the silent hall. "Lyra Ashwood will stand beside me, not as a mate accepted out of obligation or political convenience, but as an equal partner, whose voice and judgment will carry genuine weight in the decisions that shape this kingdom's future. If she chooses to accept this position, understanding fully the mistake I made and my commitment to never repeat it." Every eye in the hall turned toward Lyra, waiting for her response with an entirely different kind of anticipation than the hungry, expectant curiosity that had filled this same space 6 months earlier. This time, the silence carried genuine uncertainty rather than assumed inevitability. A court that had learned, through Draven's own visible unraveling over recent months, that this bond was not something either wolf could simply walk away from unaffected. Lyra stepped forward, meeting Draven's gaze steadily, before turning to address the assembled court directly, her voice clear and unwavering. "I accept this bond," she said, Not as the Omega who was once rejected in this hall, but as the healer and independent woman I have become, since that rejection forced me to build a life entirely my own. I accept it, understanding that this crown comes with genuine responsibility and voice, not merely ceremonial presence. And I accept it knowing that the wolf standing beside me has demonstrated, through considerable personal cost, a genuine willingness to acknowledge and correct his mistakes, rather than hide behind pride or convenient silence. The hall erupted into a mixture of applause and quiet, relieved murmuring, the tension that had gripped the court for months finally beginning to ease, as the formal bond was re-established before them. Draven reached for Lyra's hand, and this time, when their fingers intertwined, the bond between them settled fully into place, no longer festering and restless, but whole and complete for the first time since that fated ceremony 6 months earlier. The celebration following the announcement lasted well into the evening, nobles and dignitaries offering their congratulations with a warmth that felt entirely different from the cold curiosity that had once surrounded Lyra's original, disastrous introduction to this court. She found herself, more than once, having to remind herself that this was real, that the same hall which had once witnessed her humiliation now celebrated her return with genuine enthusiasm. But the peace of that evening proved short-lived. Just past midnight, as the celebration began winding down and most guests had retired to their quarters, a guard burst into the war room, where Draven and Marcus had retreated, to review final security arrangements before the night's end. The guard's expression carried unmistakable urgency, his breathing still ragged from what had clearly been a hard ride. "My king," he said, barely pausing to catch his breath. "Greyfell forces have crossed the northern border. A significant contingent, moving faster than our scouts anticipated. They'll reach the outer settlements within hours." Draven's expression hardened instantly, all traces of the evening's celebration vanishing, as decades of military training took over. "Numbers?" he demanded. "Difficult to confirm precisely, but scouts estimate at least 200 armed wolves, possibly more," the guard reported. "They're moving with unusual speed and coordination, suggesting this was planned well in advance." Marcus's face had gone pale. "This is retaliation for the announcement," he said grimly. "They must have had spies within the hall itself, relaying word the moment it happened." "It doesn't matter what triggered it," Draven said, already moving toward the door, his voice sharp with command. "Sound the alarm. I want every available guard mobilized and moving toward the northern settlements within the hour. Send riders to the neighboring garrisons, requesting immediate reinforcement." Lyra, who had followed the commotion from the celebration hall, arrived just in time to hear the full extent of the threat, her stomach dropping at the realization of what her return had potentially set into motion.
"This is because of me,"
she said quietly, though not as a question. "This is because Greyfell has been searching for an excuse to test our defenses for months," Draven corrected firmly, turning to face her directly, despite the urgency pressing at him from every direction. "The announcement may have accelerated their timeline, but this threat existed long before you returned to Blackthorn. Do not carry blame that isn't yours to bear." There was little time for further reassurance. Within the hour, the castle had transformed entirely, the celebratory atmosphere replaced by the tense, coordinated urgency of a kingdom preparing for genuine conflict. Guards moved in organized formations toward the northern gates, war horns sounding across the castle grounds, servants hurrying to prepare medical supplies and emergency provisions for what was clearly shaping into a significant confrontation. Lyra found herself pulled instinctively toward the medical preparations, rather than remaining in the relative safety of the castle's inner chambers, her training as a healer overriding any impulse toward passive waiting. She located Fenwick, already directing a team of assistants in preparing emergency supplies, and fell into step beside him without hesitation. "You should remain in the castle, my lady," Fenwick said, though his tone carried more concern than actual command. "The northern settlements will see fighting tonight. It's dangerous territory for anyone, let alone the kingdom's newly acknowledged queen." "I'm a healer before I'm anything else," Lyra replied firmly, already gathering supplies of her own. "If wounded are coming, they'll need every trained hand available. I won't hide in the castle while people who need help are suffering closer to the front lines." Fenwick studied her for a brief moment, then nodded, recognizing the same stubborn determination that had clearly built an entire independent reputation in Ashenvale over 6 short months. "Then work alongside my team," he said. We'll set up a medical station at the second garrison, close enough to the fighting to receive wounded quickly, but far enough to remain reasonably secure. Draven found her briefly, before the guard contingents departed, his expression torn between the demands of his role as king and the newly formed instinct to protect his mate from any possible danger. "I need you to stay well behind the front lines," he said, his voice carrying an urgency that had nothing to do with royal command and everything to do with genuine fear for her safety. "I intend to," Lyra assured him. "I'll be at the second garrison, treating wounded as they arrive. That's where I can do the most good, and it keeps reasonable distance from the actual fighting." Draven pressed his forehead briefly against hers, a gesture more intimate than anything formal court tradition would have permitted. His wolf clearly straining against the necessity of separating from his newly settled mate so soon after finally securing the bond between them. "Stay safe," he said quietly. "You as well," Lyra replied, and meant it with an intensity that surprised even herself. 6 months of careful emotional distance, collapsing entirely in the face of genuine danger. The battle that unfolded along Blackthorn's northern border that night proved fierce, but ultimately decisive. Draven's forces, though caught somewhat off guard by the speed of Greyfell's advance, had the advantage of defending familiar territory, and had mobilized quickly enough to meet the invading force before it could penetrate deeply into settled lands. Reports filtered back to the second garrison throughout the night, carried by exhausted riders relaying updates on the shifting tide of conflict. Lyra worked tirelessly alongside Fenwick's team as wounded began arriving, her steady hands and calm demeanor proving invaluable amid the chaos of triage and treatment. She recognized, with grim clarity, exactly why her training mattered so much in moments like this. The careful, methodical approach to treating injuries that panic and fear made so much harder for less experienced healers to maintain. Near dawn, as the first reports of Greyfell's retreat began circulating through the garrison, a familiar figure was carried in on a makeshift stretcher, and Lyra's heart stopped entirely at the sight of Nathan, the steady guard who had escorted her from Ashenvale, his shoulder bleeding heavily from what appeared to be a serious blade wound. "Get him to the table immediately," she said, her voice sharp with urgent command as she rushed to examine the injury. Years of training taking over, despite the personal connection sharpening her fear. Nathan managed a weak, pained smile as she worked quickly to stem the bleeding. "Seems I owe you twice now, my lady," he said, his voice strained, but carrying a thread of genuine humor, despite his obvious pain. "Once for the ride to Blackthorn, and now for whatever you're about to do to save my arm." "Save your breath instead of making jokes," Lyra said, though her hands moved with the same steady precision that had built her entire reputation in Ashenvale, cleaning and treating the wound with careful efficiency. "You'll live, but only if you stop talking and let me work." By full morning, word arrived that Greyfell's forces had retreated entirely across the border, their advance having failed to achieve any significant territorial gain against Blackthorn's swift and organized defense. Draven himself arrived at the second garrison shortly after, exhausted and bearing minor injuries of his own, though his relief at finding Lyra safe and continuing her work among the wounded was immediately, visibly apparent. "You held the line," Lyra said, examining a shallow cut along his forearm with the same brisk efficiency she had shown every other patient that night. "We held the line," Draven corrected, watching her work with an expression that mixed exhaustion and profound gratitude. "This entire kingdom held the line tonight, and you were part of that, treating wounded from the front rather than hiding safely in the castle." "I told you I intended to be useful," Lyra said simply, finishing her work on his arm and finally allowing herself a moment to acknowledge her own exhaustion. "Not decorative." Draven caught her hand gently before she could turn back to her next patient, his expression suddenly serious despite the chaos still surrounding them. "Greyfell will likely attempt further provocations in the coming months," he said quietly. "Tonight's retreat doesn't guarantee lasting peace, but whatever comes, I want you to know that watching you work tonight, treating our wounded with the same skill and dedication you built an entire independent life around in Ashenvale, only confirmed everything I already believed about your worth. You are exactly the queen this kingdom needs, not despite your modest origins, but because of the strength and competence those origins helped you build." Lyra allowed herself a tired, genuine smile, the adrenaline of the long night finally beginning to fade into simple, profound relief. "Let's get through today first," she said, Then we can worry about tomorrow's challenges. The weeks following the battle brought a strange, uneasy quiet to Blackthorn, the kind of peace that comes not from genuine resolution, but from both sides needing time to assess their losses and reconsider their strategies. Greyfell's formal ambassadors sent stiff, carefully worded correspondence, expressing regret over the border incident. Though everyone in Blackthorn's council understood the apology carried little sincerity, merely the diplomatic necessity of avoiding further immediate escalation while Greyfell regrouped. Lyra settled into her new role with the same careful, deliberate approach she brought to everything else in her life, splitting her time between formal duties expected of a future queen and the medical work she refused to abandon. She established a small clinic within the castle grounds, training a rotating group of young healers alongside Fenwick, incorporating techniques and herbal knowledge she had refined during her time in Ashenvale that proved unexpectedly effective against ailments common even among Blackthorn's noble class. Not everyone within the court welcomed her return with unqualified enthusiasm, however. Lady Diane of the Thornwood Pack, whose name Marcus had once mentioned as a potential strategic marriage candidate, made her displeasure known through the kind of careful, polite social maneuvering that nobility excelled at, subtle comments during formal gatherings, pointed questions about Lyra's modest origins, delivered with just enough courtesy to avoid outright rudeness, while still landing their intended sting. "I simply find it curious," Diane remarked during one such gathering, her tone sweetly conversational as several other nobles listened with obvious interest, "that our king would choose an Omega, with no formal noble training over candidates who understand the delicate balance of court politics from birth. Surely there must be considerable adjustment required, learning such complex traditions at this stage." Lyra met the comment with the same calm composure she had maintained since that first, disastrous rejection, all those months ago, refusing to give Diane the satisfaction of visible offense. "I've found most political traditions considerably simpler to navigate than treating a severe infection with limited supplies in an underserved border city," she replied smoothly. "Perhaps different challenges simply require different types of expertise, Lady Diane. I imagine you would find my work equally unfamiliar, should our circumstances have been reversed." The exchange drew a ripple of quiet amusement from surrounding nobles, and Diane's carefully composed expression flickered with poorly concealed irritation before she excused herself from the conversation entirely. Draven, who had witnessed the exchange from across the room, joined Lyra shortly after, his expression carrying quiet approval. "You handled that well," he said. "I've had considerable practice handling difficult situations without losing composure," Lyra replied, though a small, satisfied smile tugged at her lips. Rejection in front of an entire court tends to build that particular skill rather effectively. Despite these occasional frictions, Lyra found genuine allies within the court as well, nobles and advisors who had watched Draven's difficult unraveling over the preceding months and recognized, more clearly than most, exactly how significant his transformation had been since the bond's proper re-establishment. Henry, the council member who had spoken with her so honestly before the announcement, became something of an informal advisor, offering guidance on court politics without ever suggesting she needed to abandon her own instincts or priorities. "The court will adjust," Henry assured her during one of their regular conversations. "Nobility respects results more than pedigree, whatever they might claim otherwise in polite conversation. Give it time, and your genuine contributions to this kingdom will speak louder than any complaint about your modest origins." His prediction proved accurate more quickly than even he anticipated. Within 2 months, Lyra's medical reforms had noticeably reduced illness rates among the castle staff and surrounding villages, her training programs producing healers with skills that quickly gained reputation beyond Blackthorn's own borders. Nobles who had initially echoed Diane's quiet skepticism found themselves increasingly relying on Lyra's clinic for their own health concerns, gradually shifting from cautious tolerance toward genuine respect. Meanwhile, tensions with Greyfell continued simmering beneath the surface of formal diplomatic correspondence, occasional border incidents testing both kingdoms' patience without escalating into full conflict again. Draven, having learned harsh lessons from his own earlier unraveling, approached these tensions with considerably more measured judgment than his previous strategic calculations had shown, consulting Lyra directly on decisions that touched both military strategy and diplomatic messaging. "You have a talent for seeing angles I miss entirely," Draven admitted one evening, reviewing border reports together in the castle's private study, a habit that had become a regular part of their partnership since her return. My instinct is always toward decisive action, sometimes too quickly. You consider consequences I would have overlooked entirely. And you understand political strategy in ways my healer's training never prepared me for, Lyra replied. That's rather the point of genuine partnership, isn't it? Neither of us needs to carry every burden alone. 6 months after the battle at the northern border, formal peace negotiations finally began between Blackthorn and Greyfell, mediated by a neutral Third Kingdom, eager to prevent further regional instability. Draven insisted, over some initial council resistance, that Lyra participate directly in the negotiations, rather than remaining in a purely ceremonial supporting role. Her perspective on the human cost of prolonged conflict matters directly to these discussions, Draven argued firmly, when several council members questioned the unusual arrangement. She has seen firsthand the wounded these border tensions produce, treated them with her own hands. That perspective belongs in this negotiation, not merely military and economic calculations. The council, having witnessed 6 months of Lyra's genuine contributions to the kingdom's stability and prosperity, offered considerably less resistance to the suggestion than they might have shown a year earlier. Lyra's presence at the negotiation table proved valuable, precisely as Draven predicted, her first-hand accounts of treating wounded soldiers from both sides of the conflict, lending a human weight to discussions that might otherwise have remained purely abstract calculations of territory and resources. The eventual peace agreement, finalized after weeks of careful negotiation, established clearer border protocols and mutual trade agreements that benefited both kingdoms considerably, reducing the tensions that had simmered for years prior to the recent conflict. Greyfell's ambassadors, initially skeptical of Blackthorn's unusual queen, left the negotiations with genuine respect for her contributions, one senior ambassador remarking privately to Marcus that the agreement's more thoughtful provisions bore clear marks of her practical, grounded perspective. Word of the successful negotiations spread throughout both kingdoms, cementing Lyra's reputation, not merely as a rejected Omega who had found her way back into royal favor, but as a genuine, valuable partner in shaping her kingdom's future. The story of her original rejection, once whispered as a cautionary tale about Omega inadequacy, gradually transformed into something entirely different in the retelling, a story about resilience, independent worth, and a king humbled enough to correct his gravest mistake. With the peace agreement finalized and the immediate threat from Greyfell resolved, attention within Blackthorn's court gradually turned toward the formal coronation ceremony that would officially recognize Lyra as queen, a much larger and more elaborate affair than the original bonding ceremony had been, drawing dignitaries and representatives from kingdoms across the region, eager to witness the resolution of what had become a widely discussed story. Lyra approached the preparations with the same practical thoughtfulness she brought to everything else, though she found herself, more than once, thinking back to her mother's small house at the edge of her original home pack, wondering how different this moment would feel, with her mother actually present to witness it. She raised the question with Draven one evening, somewhat hesitantly, uncertain how such a request might be received given the political sensitivities surrounding her modest origins. "I would like my mother present at the coronation," she said carefully. "And Oliver, the guard who helped me leave my home pack after the rejection. I understand, if that request complicates the ceremony's formal arrangements, given their standing." Draven looked at her with something between confusion and gentle amusement. "Lyra, you are about to become queen of this kingdom. If you want your mother and a childhood friend present at your own coronation, that request requires no complicated justification whatsoever. Simply tell me where to send the invitations." The relief and gratitude in Lyra's expression at his immediate, unquestioning support only reinforced how genuinely their partnership had grown since her return, a stark contrast to the political calculations that had governed his original, disastrous rejection. Grace arrived at Blackthorn 2 weeks before the coronation, her expression a mixture of pride and lingering disbelief as she took in the scale of the castle and the formal preparations surrounding her daughter's transformation from rejected Omega to reigning queen. Lyra met her mother in the castle courtyard, with an embrace that drew curious, warm attention from watching servants and nobles alike. "I always believed you would build something remarkable," Grace said, holding her daughter at arm's length, to study her carefully, noting the quiet confidence that had settled into Lyra's bearing since she had last seen her. But I confess, even I did not imagine it would look quite like this. Neither did I, Lyra admitted, laughing softly. But I think that's rather the point, isn't it? Sometimes the life you build for yourself, when everyone expects you to simply disappear into grief, ends up more meaningful than anything you could have originally planned. Oliver arrived shortly after, looking distinctly uncomfortable in the formal attire the castle staff had insisted upon for the occasion, though his obvious pride in Lyra's transformation outweighed any discomfort with unfamiliar court fashion. "You look ridiculous," Lyra told him affectionately, taking in his stiff, unfamiliar formal coat. "You look like a queen," Oliver replied, grinning despite himself, "which is considerably stranger than any coat I'm wearing, if we're being honest about strange things happening today." The coronation itself took place on a clear, bright morning, the same grand hall that had once witnessed both Lyra's humiliating rejection and her eventual triumphant return, now transformed entirely for the occasion, banners and decorations replacing the tense, formal atmosphere of previous ceremonies with genuine celebration. Lyra stood at the top of the same stone steps where she had once been so publicly cast aside, though this time the symbolism of the moment carried entirely different weight. Draven knelt before her, an unusual gesture for a reigning king, though one he had insisted upon deliberately, a public acknowledgement that their partnership was built on genuine equality, rather than his original assumption of superior standing. "6 months ago," Draven said, his voice carrying clearly through the silent hall, "I stood in this place and made the greatest mistake of my reign, rejecting a bond out of fear, disguised as strategy. Today, I kneel before the same woman I once rejected, not because tradition demands it, but because I have learned, through considerable personal cost, exactly what her worth truly means to this kingdom, and to me personally. Lyra Ashwood, will you accept this crown, not as a consolation for past wrongs, but as genuine recognition of everything you have built, and everything you continue to offer this kingdom?" "I will," Lyra said, her voice steady and clear, carrying none of the uncertainty that had once gripped her in this same hall. The formal crown, simpler and more practical than the elaborate, ornate design tradition typically demanded, settled onto her head with quiet ceremony, Draven rising afterward to stand beside her rather than above her, a small but deliberate symbol of the partnership they had built together. The celebration that followed lasted well into the evening, nobles and dignitaries from across the region offering genuine congratulations rather than the cautious curiosity that had once surrounded her original introduction to this court. Grace watched from a place of honor near the front of the gathered crowd, tears of genuine pride streaming freely down her face as she watched her daughter accept a crown that had once seemed impossibly distant. Later that evening, once the formal celebrations had wound down and only close friends and family remained, in a quieter section of the castle gardens, Lyra found herself standing alone with Draven, beneath the same tree where she had once wept silently after her original rejection, 6 months, and an entire lifetime of change ago. "Do you remember this spot?" she asked quietly. Draven's expression softened with recognition. "This is where you stood, after I rejected you," he said. "Marcus told me you came out here before the carriage arrived to take you home." "I came here because I refused to let anyone see me break down inside that hall," Lyra said, reaching out to touch the tree's rough bark gently. "This tree witnessed the worst moment of my life. I thought it fitting that it should also witness one of the best." Draven pulled her gently into his arms, and this time she allowed herself to lean into him completely. 6 months of careful distance finally dissolved entirely into genuine trust. "I will spend the rest of my reign making certain you never doubt your worth again," he said quietly. "You don't need to promise perfection," Lyra replied, tilting her head back to meet his gaze. "You simply need to keep choosing honesty over fear, the way you did when you finally admitted your original mistake. That's all any genuine partnership requires." They stood together beneath that tree for a long while, the quiet garden holding space for everything that had changed since that first, painful rejection. A rejection that had ultimately forced Lyra to discover exactly how capable and resilient she truly was, and had forced Draven to confront exactly how much his pride and fear had nearly cost him. In the months that followed, Blackthorn Kingdom flourished under their combined leadership, Lyra's practical wisdom and medical reforms strengthening the kingdom's internal stability, while Draven's renewed clarity and confidence, no longer clouded by an unresolved bond, guided careful, measured diplomacy that maintained lasting peace with Greyfell and strengthened alliances with neighboring territories. Lady Diane's quiet skepticism gradually faded into genuine, if somewhat reluctant, respect, while Henry and several other council members became firm, trusted allies in the ongoing work of building a stronger, more thoughtful kingdom. Lyra continued practicing medicine alongside her royal duties, training new generations of healers who carried her practical, grounded approach far beyond Blackthorn's own borders, her clinic eventually becoming renowned across the entire region for training methods that combined careful traditional knowledge with the kind of resourceful innovation she had first developed out of necessity in Ashenvale's competitive, independent healing community. Clara visited occasionally from Ashenvale, always remarking with quiet amusement at how strange it felt to see her former shop assistant now reigning as queen, though she noted, with clear pride, that Lyra had never lost the careful, attentive manner that had first made her such a skilled healer. "You built something remarkable here," Clara told her, during one such visit, watching Lyra move confidently through the castle's medical wing, directing young healers with the same patient expertise she had once shown in a small apothecary shop above a modest border city street. "Though I confess, I always suspected you were capable of remarkable things. Even when you first arrived in my shop with nothing but a bag of herbal notes and a broken heart, you refused to show anyone." "I learned that from you," Lyra replied warmly. "That worth isn't handed down by anyone else's judgment. It's built, carefully, through the work you choose to do and the people you choose to help, regardless of who initially believes you capable of it." The kingdom that Lyra and Draven built together in the years that followed came to be known throughout the region not merely for its military strength or economic prosperity, though both flourished considerably under their combined leadership, but for a particular kind of thoughtful, balanced governance that seemed to draw genuine strength from the partnership between a king who had learned humility through his own gravest mistake, and a queen who had built her worth entirely on her own terms before ever returning to claim the crown that had once, so publicly and painfully, been denied her. And though the story of that original rejection never entirely faded from the kingdom's memory, it transformed, gradually and completely, from a cautionary tale about an unworthy Omega into something else entirely, a story about resilience, about the genuine strength required to walk away from humiliation with quiet dignity rather than desperate pleading, and about a king humbled enough to recognize, however belatedly, that true worth was never his to judge in the first place. Word of Lyra's coronation eventually reached her original home pack, carried along the same trade routes and traveling merchants that had once spread news of her humiliating rejection with such devastating speed. The reaction there proved considerably more complicated than the straightforward celebration surrounding her in Blackthorn. Oliver, who had remained close with several members of the pack even after Lyra's departure, wrote to her with careful, wry amusement, describing the shift in attitude among people who had once treated her rejection as confirmation of some hidden inadequacy. The same cousin who had once commented at a family gathering about rejected mates carrying bad luck now apparently told anyone who would listen that she had always recognized Lyra's exceptional character, a claim Oliver found so absurd he could barely finish writing about it without adding several exasperated remarks of his own. The healer, who had grown suddenly too busy to continue Lyra's apprenticeship, now spoke of her former students' accomplishments with considerable, previously absent enthusiasm whenever the topic arose among pack members. Lyra read Oliver's letter with a complicated mixture of amusement and old, lingering hurt, though she found the pain had softened considerably compared to how sharply it had once cut. She showed the letter to Draven that evening, watching his expression shift through several emotions as he read the account of her former pack's convenient, retroactive support. "People rewrite history quickly when it becomes convenient," he observed, handing the letter back to her. "I imagine that particular skill isn't limited to any single pack or kingdom." "No," Lyra agreed. "I imagine it isn't." She considered, briefly, whether to respond to her former pack's belated warmth with anything beyond polite, distant courtesy, ultimately deciding that genuine forgiveness for the specific individuals who had treated her so poorly mattered less than simply continuing to build the life and reputation she valued, regardless of whether her former community chose to claim credit for recognizing her worth only after that worth had become undeniable and politically significant. Her relationship with her mother, however, remained as genuine and uncomplicated as it had always been, Grace having supported her daughter's choices without hesitation from the very beginning, long before any crown or formal recognition made that support convenient or fashionable among their former neighbors. Grace visited Blackthorn regularly after the coronation, eventually choosing to relocate permanently to a modest cottage within the castle grounds that Draven had personally arranged, insisting that Lyra's mother deserved comfortable, dignified accommodations, regardless of her own modest origins. "You didn't need to do this," Lyra told him when she first discovered the arrangement, genuinely moved by the gesture. "Your mother supported you unconditionally when an entire pack turned against you following my mistake," Draven replied simply. "That kind of loyalty deserves recognition, regardless of what our formal court traditions might typically dictate for the mother of a queen from modest origins." As the months settled into a comfortable, productive rhythm, Lyra found herself occasionally curious about the specific fears that had originally driven Draven toward such a devastating rejection, understanding intellectually that his father's troubled reign had shaped his decision-making, though she had never asked for the full details of that history directly. She raised the question one quiet evening as they reviewed reports together in the castle's private study, a habit that had become genuinely comfortable rather than merely dutiful over their months of partnership. "Tell me about your father," she said. Truly not the careful diplomatic version court records prefer to preserve. Draven set down the report he had been reading, considering the request carefully before answering. "My father was a good man, in many ways," he began slowly. "But he ruled almost entirely through emotion and instinct, favoring advisors and alliances based on personal affection rather than careful strategic consideration. He rejected sound counsel repeatedly because he preferred the company and flattery of those he simply enjoyed being around, regardless of whether their advice actually served this kingdom well." "That sounds difficult to watch, as his son," Lyra observed gently. "It was catastrophic, more than difficult," Draven admitted, his expression darkening with old, painful memory. During the border conflicts of his reign, he ignored his council's warnings about Greyfell's growing aggression because he had personally taken a liking to their ambassador, a charming, persuasive man who assured him repeatedly that tensions were merely misunderstandings, requiring no serious military preparation. That trust, based entirely on personal fondness rather than strategic assessment, nearly cost us the entire Northern Territory when Greyfell eventually attacked, with far greater force than anyone anticipated, catching us almost entirely unprepared. "I understand now why you feared emotional decision-making so deeply," Lyra said quietly, "though I wonder if you ever considered that your father's mistake wasn't emotion itself, but poor judgment about which emotions and which people deserved his trust." Draven looked at her with sudden, thoughtful surprise, as though the distinction had never quite occurred to him in exactly those terms before. "Go on," he said. "Your father trusted a flattering ambassador because that trust felt comfortable and pleasant, requiring nothing difficult of him," Lyra continued carefully. "That's not the same as trusting someone because they've demonstrated genuine competence and character through difficult circumstances. When you rejected me, you weren't actually avoiding your father's mistake at all. You were making an entirely different error, dismissing genuine potential worth because you assumed, without any real evidence, that an Omega from a modest pack couldn't possibly offer the same strategic value as more traditionally connected candidates. That's not emotional excess. That's a different kind of poor judgment entirely, one rooted in unexamined assumption rather than careless affection." Draven was quiet for a long moment, processing this reframing of a fear that had shaped so many of his decisions over the years. "You're right," he said finally, something like relief settling into his expression, alongside the discomfort of reassessing old assumptions. "I spent years so afraid of repeating my father's specific mistake that I built an entirely different, equally flawed pattern of judgment without ever examining it properly. I dismissed genuine merit because it arrived in a form I hadn't been trained to recognize as valuable. For what it's worth," Lyra added, "recognizing that distinction now, and correcting your behavior once you understood it clearly, matters considerably more than never having made the mistake at all. Your father, from what you've described, never seemed to examine or correct his own patterns even when the consequences became severe. You have. That's the difference that actually matters." The conversation settled something between them that had never been fully addressed even amid all their careful discussions since her return. a deeper understanding of exactly how Draven's specific fears had shaped his original decision, and genuine confidence that he had done the difficult work of examining and correcting those patterns, rather than simply apologizing for their consequences without truly understanding their root. Nathan, the guard who had been so seriously wounded during the battle with Greyfell, recovered fully over the following months under Lyra's careful medical supervision, eventually returning to active duty with a newfound, considerable loyalty to the Queen who had personally overseen his treatment, despite her formal royal responsibilities. Most nobles wouldn't bother remembering an ordinary guard's name, let alone checking on his recovery personally, Nathan remarked to Marcus one afternoon, watching Lyra move through the castle's medical wing, checking on various patients with the same careful attention she gave every single person under her care, regardless of their standing within the kingdom's hierarchy. "She's not most nobles," Marcus replied simply, though something like genuine pride colored his tone, as he watched the Queen he had once worried might never properly settle into her role, move through the castle with confident, purposeful ease. She never intended to be. Nearly a year after the coronation, Blackthorn hosted a regional gathering of allied kingdoms, a formal summit intended to strengthen trade agreements and diplomatic relationships across the wider territory, following the resolved tensions with Greyfell. It was, in many ways, the largest and most significant political event Lyra had participated in since becoming queen, drawing dignitaries from kingdoms she had never even visited, each arriving with their own expectations and assumptions about Blackthorn's unusual, much-discussed queen. She noticed, within the first day of the gathering, a familiar kind of careful, curious scrutiny in the way certain visiting nobles observed her, the same assessing gaze she remembered from her original, disastrous introduction to Blackthorn's own court over a year earlier. Word of her modest origins and dramatic rejection story had clearly traveled well beyond Blackthorn's borders, and not every visiting dignitary approached the story with the same eventual respect her own kingdom's court had gradually developed. A visiting duke from a distant southern territory, a stout, self-important wolf named Edmund, made his skepticism known during a formal dinner early in the summit, his comments delivered with the same practiced, deniable courtesy Lady Diane had once employed. "It's certainly an unusual story, your rise to this position," Edmund remarked, his tone carrying just enough genuine curiosity to avoid outright offense, while still clearly probing for some reaction he could interpret according to his own assumptions. "Most kingdoms maintain rather strict traditions regarding appropriate mates for their rulers. I confess, I'm curious how Blackthorn's council ultimately reconciled themselves to such a significant departure from those traditions." Lyra met his gaze evenly, recognizing the familiar shape of the question beneath its polite phrasing. Blackthorn's council reconciled themselves to the departure by observing results rather than clinging to assumptions, she replied smoothly. "Tradition serves a kingdom well when it reflects genuine wisdom accumulated over time. It serves a kingdom poorly when it simply reflects unexamined habit mistaken for wisdom. I suspect every kingdom eventually faces a choice between honoring which version of tradition it has actually been following." Edmund's expression flickered with mild surprise at the directness of her response, clearly having expected either defensive discomfort or polite deflection, rather than a considered challenge to his underlying assumption. Several nearby dignitaries exchanged quiet, amused glances at the exchange, and Draven, seated beside her, allowed himself a small, proud smile that he made no effort to hide. "Perhaps you might elaborate," Edmund said, his tone shifting toward genuine curiosity now, rather than careful probing. "On what results, specifically, you believe justify this particular departure from tradition?" Lyra spent the following several minutes outlining, with the same practical clarity she brought to every discussion, the concrete improvements her medical reforms had brought to Blackthorn's healing practices, the meaningful role she had played in successfully negotiating lasting peace with Greyfell, and the broader thoughtful, balanced governance that had characterized Blackthorn's leadership since Draven had corrected his original, fear-driven mistake. By the time she finished, Edmund's skepticism had visibly softened into something closer to genuine reconsideration, and several other visiting dignitaries who had been listening quietly nodded along with evident agreement. "I confess," Edmund said finally, "I arrived at this summit, prepared to find an interesting curiosity, a king whose personal circumstances had produced an unusual, but ultimately minor deviation from expected practice. I am reconsidering that assessment, rather significantly this evening." Most people do, eventually, Draven said, speaking for the first time since the exchange began, his tone carrying quiet, genuine pride, rather than defensive protectiveness. I certainly did, though it took me considerably longer, and cost me considerably more than a single dinner conversation to reach that reconsideration. The summit concluded successfully several days later, strengthened trade agreements, and diplomatic relationships firmly established across the region. Blackthorn's reputation enhanced not merely by its economic and military stability, but by the genuine respect its unusual queen had earned through direct, thoughtful engagement, rather than simple ceremonial presence. That evening, once the visiting dignitaries had departed and the castle had settled back into its familiar, quieter rhythm, Lyra and Draven walked together through the same gardens that had witnessed so much of their complicated history, from her original silent grief following the rejection, to his desperate apology months later, to the coronation that had finally, formally settled their bond before the entire kingdom. "Do you ever think about that night?" Draven asked quietly, as they paused beneath the same tree that had become an unspoken, meaningful landmark in their shared history. The rejection itself, I mean. Do you still carry any of that pain? Lyra considered the question honestly, taking her time before answering, unwilling to offer either false reassurance or unnecessary dwelling on old wounds that had genuinely healed. "I carry the memory of it," she said finally. "I don't think that particular memory will ever fully disappear, nor do I think it should. It shaped too much of who I eventually became, the independence I built in Ashenvale, the resilience that allowed me to return here on my own terms, rather than simply accepting whatever role was originally offered to me. But the pain itself, the sharp, immediate hurt of that specific moment, that faded considerably, once I understood the full context of your fear, and watched you genuinely work to correct it, rather than merely apologize for its consequences." "I'm grateful for that," Draven said quietly, "though I recognize I have no right to expect it, given what that rejection cost you." "Gratitude isn't required," Lyra replied, leaning into him comfortably beneath the tree's bare branches. "What's required is exactly what you've continued doing every day since that public announcement, choosing honesty over convenient assumption, choosing genuine partnership over comfortable hierarchy. As long as you continue choosing that, the old pain matters considerably less than everything we've built since." They stood together in comfortable silence for a long while, the quiet garden holding space for everything that had passed between them. The humiliation and grief of that original rejection transformed, through considerable difficult work on both their parts, into a partnership neither of them could have fully anticipated when Lyra first walked out of that grand hall with her chin held high, refusing to give her audience the tears they had so eagerly expected. The kingdom of Blackthorn continued to flourish in the years that followed, its reputation growing steadily among neighboring territories not merely for military strength or economic prosperity, though both remained considerable under their combined leadership, but for a particular kind of thoughtful governance that seemed to draw genuine strength from the balance between a king who had learned humility through his own gravest error, and a queen who had proven, through both quiet resilience and eventual triumphant return, that true worth was never something anyone else held the authority to judge or dismiss. And though visitors to Blackthorn's court still occasionally whispered about the story behind their unusual queen, the tale that traveled across the region no longer carried the shape of tragedy or cautionary warning it once had. It had become, instead, a story people told with genuine admiration, about an Omega who refused to break when the world expected her tears, and an Alpha King who learned, through considerable personal cost, that the true measure of strength lay not in rejecting vulnerability, but in having the courage to admit fault and rebuild what his own fear had nearly destroyed. Lyra Ashwood never forgot the girl who had once walked silently out of that grand hall, dignity intact despite devastating public humiliation. She carried that memory forward, not as a wound, but as the foundation of everything she eventually became, proof that sometimes, the moments meant to break a person completely become instead the exact moments that reveal precisely how unbreakable they truly were all along.